It is so great to see everybody this morning. Rafi, could we go to the next slide? We're so delighted that you're choosing to spend your Saturday morning with us. We have a fantastic program for you. Thank you, first of all, to Rafi and to Anne Rieselbach and Alicia Botero of the League staff for the huge amount of work that it takes to put this program together. I know that you're going to enjoy it. And now on to what I am positive is going to be an extremely interesting series of presentations by our panelists this morning. First, Delma Palma from the New York City Housing Authority, then Todd Palmer from the Diversity and Design Collaborative at Herman Miller, and then Beau Liu and Andreas Kostopoulos, both from Diller, Scofidio, and Renfro. Thank you, and see you later.
All right. Hi, everybody. I'm Delma Palma, Deputy Director of Architecture and Urban Planning at the New York City Housing Authority. Hopefully you all can hear me. Great to be here this morning, and thank you for having me. Just a little bit of background on the Housing Authority for those of you who may not be as familiar. I'm going to refer to it as NYCHA from now on. That's the shorthand, and it's the largest housing authority in North America that oversees the public housing in New York City. So I will go through a little bit of my journey here to NYCHA, starting with kind of where I began it all, architecture school. So if we can go to the next slide. I grew up in South Florida. So I'm originally from an area, Bonita Springs, Fort Myers, Florida, where there is a large migrant worker community. I have immigrant parents who came from Honduras and really valued housing, always talked about it in that way, and then also used it as a way to improve their social mobility. So as they progressed, they came in the 80s, it really helped improve their social mobility, and that always stuck with me. So when I was looking for a profession for things to do, I was interested in, like many of you, probably drawing, physical space, buildings. And so I looked into the field of architecture, ended up at the University of Notre Dame, which is actually one of the few architecture schools that does classical training in the country. So we really leaned into studying a lot of the classical forms that you see in Western Europe, like some of the images that you see here. And we did a lot of traveling, and in all of the traveling and the learning that I did, I always found this tension with what my actual interests were and what I knew the physical world and the design of the built environment had done for me and my family, and what I was seeing in the history that I was learning. So on the right side of the slide, you see an internship that I did, which was for a social housing nonprofit, the largest nonprofit in Latin America. It's called Techo, which means roof in Spanish. And it focused on emergency housing in rural parts of Latin America in about 15 to 20 different Latin American countries. And so that was my first real exposure to sort of large scale emergency housing issues, as well as what the nonprofit and public sector can do for that. So if we go to the next slide. After school, I was, of course, still really interested in the impact of housing, particularly affordable housing on communities. And so I went to an architecture and urban planning firm that focused on that. So I did a lot of work across the United States in different communities were starting to see their public housing communities come to a state of disrepair. A lot of them were being razed and replaced through several initiatives that were government funded, and working to design and essentially revitalize lots of those communities, lots of communities of color, low-income communities. We go to the next slide. Through that work, and because I was living in Washington, D.C., I got really exposed and interested in the policymaking aspect of design and construction, and who was making these decisions to build housing and where, and who gets to sell it and own it, and all of those different questions. And so that was my first involvement in that intersection, also working with a lot of the public housing authorities that I was at my firm. And so if we go to the next slide. I became involved in this fellowship that's called the Rose Fellowship, which takes emerging architectural professionals and puts them all over the country in to focus on low-income housing or affordable housing in communities that are low income or historically disinvested in, but from the owner side. So embedded in development companies or public agencies like NYCHA, and to be able to understand these issues across the country. So from rural to very urban, like New York City, I was able to really learn from this cohort about what are the main issues impacting the country in terms of housing, but then also what were a lot of the similarities, because we are still living in an affordable housing crisis, but a lot of the same issues are impacting people in Green River, Utah, and New York City and Boston. So that was a very helpful way for me to get a national perspective on housing, but also for me to transition into the public sector. So I went from the private sector to the public sector, having not public sector experience before, but still with this support system of a group of people, but also a nonprofit organization. Enterprise Community Partners is the sponsor of this fellowship. So they were able to provide a lot of the resources and keep you connected to this network of individuals that made the transition into public sector work a little bit easier. So if we go to the next slide. Another thing I did when I moved to New York City to work for NYCHA was get involved in the Civic Leadership Program at the AIA, because it really started to connect me with the network of individuals that were locally based as opposed to nationally based, but that were interested in these similar types of civic issues that impacted the country. And then how do we distill it and talk about it with the New York City lens, particularly a lot of times with the public sector lens, because we talked a lot about public investment in New York City historically, but also in the future and how we wanted to see things change. Okay, and so I've been at NYCHA about 4 years now. And so my first charge when I got there was to really look at the whole portfolio. And here you can see where NYCHA developments are across the city. They're almost in every community district. We housed about 500,000 people, over 500,000 New Yorkers. We're the largest landlord in the city. And so how do you look at that portfolio and how it interacts with the rest of the city and the physical environment, and really start to build a more comprehensive plan? And so it was about how does NYCHA engage with other city agencies, but other stakeholders, including community members, to look at the urban design and planning of this portfolio. Go to the next slide. And how to make that community led, right? How participatory design was at the heart of the work that I had done in the private sector and wanted to keep doing at NYCHA with public housing communities. So the focus of the work was how do you do participatory design and urban design across the 2,400 acres that NYCHA owns and manages in New York City. Next slide. And it was really started with a culture change because it wasn't historically how things had been done. I mean, NYCHA is an agency of 10,000 employees. So if you can wrap your mind around that, it's a big place and things move slowly, as in many city agencies. But to really get people on board to this idea of better connecting through design, through physical design, we had to talk to the lawyers, to the accountants, to everybody who was involved in having this and helping this agency run, so that they could be persuaded that this was a benefit to the communities and also worth pursuing. If we go to the next slide, we had to do a lot of pilots. So we tested many processes, things that hadn't been done before, which is sometimes tricky to do in government because you always want to be sure that you're mindful of how you're obviously spending tax dollars and doing things that have been proven before. But sometimes you need to prove things for yourselves in your own agencies within your own parameters. And so that's what we started to do. We started to pilot a lot of these participatory design processes at different projects across the city. And then we were tackling big issues in those projects as well. So despite the fact that they were, mostly focused around urban design, there's a lot you can do with urban design to tackle the imminent threats that we face today, like climate change. So we were trying always to leverage every project we did to do multiple things. So here you see a project we did with the Department of Environmental Protection to actually capture a significant amount of stormwater from a storm like the Ida storms we saw recently. And then the photo on the right is something we did with the Trust for Public Land, a national nonprofit that works to help create and preserve parkland in urban and non-urban environments, and really with a focus on health and how do you match program partners to resident communities and give them the physical space to utilize. Next slide. And then I wanted to throw this slide up here because it's what you really don't see done a lot of times in public sector or government work, which is the nuts and bolts of the nitty-gritty procedures and processes that put things into place to improve things. And when you do it on a scale like NYCHA, which manages about $1 billion of design and construction work each year, even making tweaks to small processes like this can make a huge impact. So one thing we did was embed participatory design principles and time and efforts into our design schedules. And that was going to really make a significant impact across the portfolio. Another big accomplishment for us was to be able to communicate these ideas clearly to all of our stakeholders. So residents, city agencies, designers, development teams. And so we, in the middle of the pandemic, released the Connected Communities Guidebook, which is urban design guidelines, but also community engagement guidelines that we did in partnership with the Department of City Planning, and really is going to continue to guide all of our work moving forward. So those are just the chapters. We can drop the link in the chat and you guys can explore it. But it was really important for us that this book be accessible and be a hard copy that we could give out to residents. We didn't want this to be a design resource that sat on a shelf or was only open via PDF ever. So actually this past weekend, we were able to distribute about 100 hard copies to public housing residents in Queensbridge. So continues to be out there. And then just to close out on a very exciting project that we just finished, which was our open space master plan, looking at our whole portfolio of land and how it can be redesigned to meet the current needs of today. The demographics of these populations have changed significantly since the public housing was built, but not often has been updated to meet these demands of climate change, health, public safety that we're seeing today. And so really taking a holistic approach of that across the portfolio, but also making it accessible to residents, putting it online on a digital map, and using it as a fundraising mechanism to be able to improve these spaces for future generations. So that's all from me for now, but I look forward to hearing your questions in the discussion. Thank you.
All right, I'm Todd Palmer, currently the Director of Diversity and Design. And I'd like to talk to you today about, as we all are, but just the pathway to this moment in my career. A lot of the conversations that we're having at Diversity and Design, which I'll talk about at the end more, are really about how do we open up more inclusive pathways for designers of color broadly, but specifically at this moment, 2 months into my tenure, focusing on Black designers. So I've been thinking about that. I took from the middle slide, or the middle image here, took a sabbatical from leadership of the Chicago Architecture Biennial. I led 2 editions in 2017 and 2019, participated in the 2015, the first biennial, as a partner at the National Public Housing Museum, which I'll also talk about. And in reflecting on my 10 years of leadership experience and more broadly, my career in design as an exhibit designer, as a museum planner, the pandemic happened, I had a lot more time to reflect than I had expected. And I've been reflecting on just what's the nature of my path. It's not a usual path. I studied on the left image at Columbia University, got a graduate school of architecture degree, was planning at that time to be a scholar, and had some major deviations, which I'll talk about. So the themes that I like to reflect on are design politics, my work to transform how we think about the agency and power of architects and designers, and to think about how architecture as a field has limits and boundaries and that have been set on its concerns, its techniques, and its actions, and how do we push against these expansively and with purpose. Spatial evidence refers to a tangible concern in a field that defines itself by building, and we see some exhibits here. I've been focused on traces and residues and artifacts, sometimes literally artifacts, and that we think of architecture as lasting and sort of monumental, but Black and other people of color and indigenous practices often manifest architecture in ways that are less tangible, no less spatial. And how do we bring that into our thinking? And finally, for a field that often emphasize, and so I feel ironic, I'm talking about myself, that emphasizes the soul figure, the ego. How do we reflect more on the inherent nature of collaboration? So these themes will come up as we go through. So next slide. I've also had some time to reflect on where I'm from, and it's always a complicated answer. It depends on how you're talking. My people are from Mississippi. My mother grew up in Louisville. I was born in Indiana. My father is from East Chicago. And my path into architecture really is reflected by some of the obstacles they face. So my father in the right, I knew always that he had wanted to be an architect, but it wasn't until the biennial, this project is by Sana, working with students from IIT, that as he pointed to the model, he explained that he actually got into IIT. So this was, 2017, I had no idea that had he not followed his father's wishes for him to become a lawyer at Indiana University, he would have never met my mother. So it's, it's like a Hollywood movie. Like if he had been an architect, I would not exist. So I was able to become an architect against his grandfather's wishes, also against my grandmother's wishes. My mother's mother was, we'll look at her in a second, was a political figure. My mother was an interior designer. We're seeing some of her work. Next slide. But her mother was a Democratic candidate for mayor, was an alderman in the city of Louisville, Kentucky. My grandfather was a doctor who went to Howard, one of the historically Black colleges. On the right image, my other grandmother, my father's mother, was working class janitor in Inland Steel building. Inland Steel, the plant that makes steel. There's a famous SOM building in Chicago, you may know, the Inland Steel building. So far away from that sort of privileged notion of architecture. My grandmother, that was a political figure, really adamantly was upset when my first year at Princeton, where I had gone to study international relations, and she thought that I was on my way to becoming the first Black president. Everyone was very disappointed and thrilled, of course, when Obama took that honor. But that for her, architecture was a place where I would be disempowered. As she understood it, was a place that, young men, like perhaps a generation removed from that first slide that Rosalie shared of the Architectural League, white men of privilege with contacts at high levels could succeed, and certainly was not going to be a place that would be a path that I could follow. But I nevertheless persisted. Next slide. So one of the things that's interesting to me, again, you go through life and then things come back, was that my first influences in architecture then were through this lens of my mother, who is in a discipline, interior design, against her mother's wishes. It's also not quite architecture. And things that we had around the house, like Herman Miller chairs, she was a commercial interior designer, or Knoll pattern books. didn't really resonate. We didn't talk about Herman Miller at Columbia University or Knoll. That's furniture, industrial design. My father worked in this building on the right as a corporate attorney. So a generation of Black men, he graduated the year I was born, 1968. So I'm kind of Generation X perspective on this conversation. But my grandfather, as a Black doctor, worked in the Black community. My father, a generation later, as a Black lawyer, always was in rooms of white men and was working. And if you integrated at this moment, this is when he worked for General Electric. But this building was not in the canon. I loved it. I blame my becoming an architect a little bit on going to visit my father in this magnificent building. It's actually by the Architects Collaborative, which is a team that follows Gropius at GSD and really rethinks a firm. It's kind of, everyone gets credit, it shares across. But in my time studying architecture school, this was not this Architects Collaborative I discovered quite by accident. Later in life, being fascinated by, well, who actually designed that building? So part of my work has been, reframing canons and rethinking whose stories get told. Next slide. So from Princeton, where I studied history of architecture against my grandmother's wishes, I also was doing a lot of art projects. And so my portfolio when I got into to Columbia, was really art-based. And a lot of the work that I did was more theoretical. I was doing writing, as I mentioned. I was planning to get a PhD. Next slide. But my last project with Hani Rashid, I think I was always reflecting on that I didn't go the political route. And so I was touching on topics of politics. This project was a collectively constructed room that you saw in the first image. There's on the right it's like a, what do you call this? Back in the day when we printed photos, forgetting the name of when you have all the photos on the roll. But I was inspired actually to not so much by my professor in this regard. This studio was actually about the pseudo event and it was kind of very theoretical, but by peers just a few years ahead of me. So I had the great fortune of being at Columbia at the same time as Mabel Wilson, who was just mentioned, who's done groundbreaking work on resurfacing and reframing Black contributions to the built environment. But at the time, a few years ahead, her third-year thesis looked at Toni Morrison in The Bluest Eye. So this oblique reference, you see this convicted. I was thinking about the Tawana Brawley case, which is this moment in the 90s. It's very complicated racial discussion in New York. And thinking about traces and evidence and in the context of pseudo event, I can't begin to unpack this in the time I have, but it's also just a reflection on the path I began to be interested in documentation and evidence and political questions and exhibition as a technique that would bring me sort of into physical manifestations of built practice and spatial practice. Next slide. So this is kind of like a diagram of three major themes that if I were to tell my story, I could tell it in three different ways, and we'll try to cover these in turn. So if you imagine that these are parallel timelines from early to the present, one set of paths leads through commissioned client-based projects, working sometimes for exhibition design firms, including Ralph Applebaum Associates, my own firm called Program Collective. My last project in that thread was collaborating as a exhibition specialist on the David Adjaye designed and Freelon Bond designed National Museum of African American History of Culture in Washington, DC. In the middle path, just on this slide, it's the middle, that section doesn't reflect any precedents, but perhaps a core for me, coming from someone that was thinking of getting a PhD, was a more experimental path. Self-generated projects or invitations to be critical or reflective, including illustrated a chance to be part of Harlem World, the really only significant exhibition of Black architects and designers until just this last year. The MoMA did the incredible show that Mabel Wilson actually curated. My work as a curator at the National Public Housing Museum is included, and my work on occasion as a writer and essayist, including for the AV Review, I put in that track. And then finally, I could have made 2 columns, but limited space. And then as I reflected, I realized that my path as a teacher, my first job actually after Columbia was teaching high school in Miami, design history in the public schools in Miami. It's 80% Black and brown students, Cuban students, Haitian students, Black American students. This is an example of one of my students' projects that he realized. It was a hands-on studio approach to teaching history. And I somehow used my time. So I'm gonna quickly, well, this slide is great because it takes you through the path to the biennial. And oh, can we just pass through just some slides? So an important thing that we can talk about in the discussion is the important role that people play. And my colleagues, my mentors that are sometimes a few years ahead through many reversals, including 9/11. Next slide. Next slide. My work as an exhibit designer. Next slide. Reflecting on this middle path of critical conversation. Next slide. The value of sometimes taking a break and reflecting, which is has given me this overview. Next slide. Questions of the hand. So as a maker, like what role do we play? But architecture is inherently collaborative. Next slide. Some of my work. So as a designer, producer, but also as a curator, my hand in it. Next slide. But also fundamentally, next slide, these projects are very collaborative. Thinking about who cares for architecture, being an organizer and administrator. We'll talk about diagrams at CHA or NYCHA and the Chicago Housing Authority. Next slide. And learning has been a theme of my leadership, which we'll talk about DID and how it manifests in that. So a lot of my work then is being bringing people together to reconsider what architecture means and can do, and hope to talk more about that in the discussion. So those influences were critical. And thank you.
Hi, I guess I can start. I'm also running a timer on my end, just to keep track of time. So hi, my name is Beau Liu, and I am currently an associate architect at Diller, Scofidio, Renfro. I joined a studio about 2013, right after I graduated from grad school at Columbia. And so I guess I've been at the studio for about 8+ years, which is, longer than I thought. As part of, next slide, please. Sorry, I forgot that you have to do that. So as part of just looking back, diving back in time and understanding like, what are the motivations for getting me into architecture and, specifically at a firm like DSR, I wanted to both look at my contextual like built environment and some of the motivations that led me to pursue this path, but also really just be honest with the actual motivations that made me stay on the path. So I'll try to talk about both things, especially with like the ongoing conversations that our studio is having with like DEI, or just even broadening the way that we're practicing as a profession that is a little bit more capital A architecture. Like these are ongoing conversations that we're having internally. And I just wanted to also be clear to myself and to the audience here as to what are the motivations that kind of keeps you on, let's say, motivated and excited by the discipline that we're in. And so looking back at my past, trying to see like this is an apartment that I grew up in Yinchuan, Ningxia, and this is like post-Soviet architecture, mostly brick and mortar. I don't even think there was any kind of reinforced steel. So if there was an earthquake, and this area is very prone to earthquakes, we would have all been done. And so like growing up in this environment, but there were a lot of housing that were rapidly built at the time because the population was growing, and they're really trying to provide good social housing that was equitable for everyone. Obviously left a lot to be desired from my perspective. So next slide. And at one point, my parents immigrated to Canada, which I'll touch on later. And this little dépanneur that you see at the bottom was kind of like in New York, it's a bodega. My parents followed a lot of the immigrants' path. They opened up a bodega, they bought it. And this area was not necessarily the most safe. We actually lived in the apartment that was on the 3rd floor, right above that's the store. The stair was kind of shaking every time you go up. And we were very foreign to this entirely new environment. And my parents found, a few like Korean and Asian kind of friends to like relate to, but they were in a way also trying to figure out what they were doing in this new living environment. Next slide. And we did move around a lot due to a lot of financial reasons. I think my parents thought that there were more job opportunities in North Carolina, particularly in Charlotte. And this was like a total like culture shock for me to live in gated communities. And these were still on the more affordable end of apartments that we could find. Very isolated. You have to drive around via, cars all the time. You barely saw anyone. For the benefit of getting a lot of nature around, we were actually nestled in a golf course. It was very isolating and very, it kind of struck a deep chord with me on like wanting to really change the environment that I was living in and the environment that my parents were able to afford us as a family. So the next slide, we did finally make an upgrade when we moved back to Canada. So this is a series of connected townhouses, and we're the one on the image right. There's like a set of 6 windows or 4 windows at the top and a door and a sliding door. So that's still our house at the moment. My parents are there. It's very tight, but we were finally able to have multi-story house and a bit of cross ventilation in the house, which was really nice. But it definitely, I think, just examining this series of environments, next slide, and the kind of context that I grew up traveling between different countries and different kind of social economic classes. I mean, mainly just one social economic class, but seeing that there's rapid industrialization and rapid urbanization in one part of the world and a different kind of growth and different sets of challenges in, let's say, the Western part of the hemisphere, and really trying to grapple like, what am I able to do? And also trying to figure out, where do I belong in this rapidly changing context that is very difficult to understand and grapple with. So next slide. And it kind of led to this constant question that I still ask to this day, where is my home and what is it? And charting through the different ages that I kind of grew up in and the different environments that I was in a way sometimes chose or sometimes subjected to. In the earlier years, I really had no choice. My parents immigrated and you kind of live wherever you are. Frequently, we, had to share the same bedroom, ultimately to later on, and when I started to go to college, I went to university at McGill, pursued architecture, and it was clear to me that I have to really take agency over my environment, whether I like the environment or not, and find opportunities despite it not being as familiar, but being constantly changing, that there's always something that I can make use of and find a way to kind of empower myself, but also the communities that I'm around, and especially kind of give back to, like fundamentally my parents who worked really hard to get us somewhere that, were kind of, that still brought a lot of struggle for them as a family. And I think that represents a greater challenge of a lot of immigrant families. But next slide, what I also realized is that within this like challenge of trying to like get more agency and also work within constantly changing environments, that perhaps my home isn't necessarily what a traditional home is. And it's more really the greater sense of what the public spaces. And with that, like finding work opportunities, finding an education, and really fighting for every moment that you can really exert publicness in the work and in the kind of relationships that you establish throughout your academic career and your school career. That's something that became gradually clearer to me. Next slide. And looking back at what my parents came from. So they were immediately brought in as refugees from the Tiananmen massacre, and they were originally graduate students studying in Canada that went back to China, and then they had to come back. And so our whole family kind of arrived as refugees. And to this day, I think, especially seeing what's happening right now around the world, to this day, I think my parents still kind of question whether or not that was the right move, despite it being a promise of, freedom of expression, the freedom of being yourself. There's a sense of loss of identity, of displacement, and ultimately not quite knowing what reality is given how things are changing and being stuck in between politics. So moving forward, that came now, like looking back at myself, I had always wanting to find a way to understand what genuinely motivates me. And clearly, I think it was from drawing at a very early age, next slide, and finding ways of really kind of understanding what forms of expression were really important to me, next slide, and what kind of spaces those expression needed to really happen, and really pushing for that, regardless of where I was at school, where I was in my career, and always looking at the kind of in-between spaces, the unseen spaces, and really drawing through it, expressing it, capturing it, which led me to, next slide, DSR. It was a bit of a surprise to me as to how I got here, and it was through luck and through timing that I was also able to work on projects that all straddle different frameworks of public space. So 3 projects I want to quickly talk through are this university building, which is education. Another one is a tower coming forth, and the last one is a museum. But this building, each of these had the various sets of challenges. This one had so many different programs from 10 different departments that all had different requirements on a driveway out of all places to build, given the limitations of the city, and a lot of NIMBYism given from the city. So there were a lot of challenges in actually making this building even happen because of finances, because of politics. And we really were trying to find things to defend, especially as a young designer. So next slide, there's a picture of a stair. And also this diagram is the building effectively wants to be a flat office building, given all the demands that required out of it. And we had to also preserve historic building, and even at the orange at the bottom, actually exert the notion of a recital hall that's floating in midair. And connecting through all of this was what I thought was, next slide, fundamentally the most important, was the public space where all discourse and all commingling and interchange happens. Next slide. And really using this opportunity to work with the engineers, work with the student body, work with the user groups, and seeing what was important, and really expressing the inside out. And next slide, finding that the recital hall had to be something that we had to defend, given that this is the only place where students actually get a really a privileged view that often is only given to paid customers at like a fancy hall. And so these were moments that we really felt that we had to defend and work through a lot of engineering consultant political challenges. And the next project, which you wouldn't necessarily think is something that I would have gotten into, which is more of a residential tower. Again, next slide, you can just quickly go through these, was the constraints of the fact that, as an office, we did build a High Line, but we are also aware it caused a lot of gentrification, which led to this idea that the related company as a private developer wanted to capitalize on that and make us build a tower. Initially, we didn't want to. So we thought, how can we capitalize on this idea that we are being constrained, literally pre-Me Too era, forcing this idea of a corset onto the building, and using that as an opportunity to really express what was actually happening inside, which were some of the more public amenities. And the idea that we were constrained by like a lot of the forces outside of our control. This diagram is going crazy. So what ultimately happened was a lot of, it had to go through redesign. And this is when I joined. If you can pause on this image, we understood of the financial challenges. And again, I was still early on in my career, really focusing on what were the opportunities that I, as a young designer, and recognizing that in this very big field that has a lot of systemic challenges, both as a woman, both as, I guess I'm Asian and person of color, and not necessarily being perceived as someone who has a voice in the conversation, trying to find ways initially to really express that through the architecture that I was doing. And now that I'm a little bit older, actually being able to voice my opinions and kind of design agency in an environment that is often very challenging to kind of let you voice your opinions in. And so finding those moments that you can really focus on getting things done really well is, I think, something that I learned through working at this office, is that and specifically, next slide, making even sure that the base architecture that maybe not necessarily everyone focuses on, fins that deal with mechanical louvers, or even expressing the fundamental idea of a strap landing, or even the subtlety of stone being carved away, but all fundamentally expressing the idea that we are trying to preserve this notion that the building is really trying to bulge through its constraints. And here are pictures of it going under construction. And like finding moments where like the pinch point, and all of this was actually engineeringly quite challenging, as the glass actually had to be cold bent on site. So these are flat glass, and we were trying to prove that we could actually bend it. And we wrote our own, Grasshopper scripts to like prove, hey, we can actually do this, like developer, don't mess with us. We know what we're talking about. And often that's the constant challenge of dealing with difficult clients, is to really kind of really find a way to both narrate your belief and also fight for it. Which leads me to my final project that I want to show really quickly, is a museum. And this was, I would say, like a once in a lifetime opportunity that also faced a lot of challenges. Very, very low budget, believe it or not, for the V&A collection in London. It was an existing building. That we had to retrofit and create a storage warehouse that was both a museum but also a storage facility for a lot of the artwork that the museum had, and playing on the idea that storage is actually equally important. And thinking about like all the experiences I've gone through, all the elements that make up architecture are not just structure, not just facade, all the basic elements that you would have studied in school, but the actual contents and the user experience that comes with it, and finding ways of maximizing that experience, and also understanding what are the potentials of even just using the objects themselves to create moments of path, moments of discovery. And here is like the central hall view, which you're really seeing like the architecture is actually the objects themselves and the facilities that they're holding them in. And knowing that these are moments that are ultra open to the public that traditionally haven't been able to be seen, given that they're all stored away or they're weatherized. Both, it's an engineering challenge, but also really fighting for this idea to the client, who was very hesitant on accepting this as an idea to begin with. And again, kind of tracking back as to what were the essential things that were really important to me as a designer when working through all these projects, and kind of seeing them getting built, and really defending the kind of professional aspects of it, given the kind of complex politics that I am still constantly grappling with my family's history and background, and whether or not I should be doing museums or I should be doing towers. But at the end, like finding these moments of kind of innovation and using that as a path, using that as a vehicle to kind of push forward your career. So that's it. Sorry for taking a little bit over time.
Hi, I'm Andreas. I've also been with Duchess of Devonshire since 2012. I have worked in various projects from the culture set, MoMA, a lot of spaces you have seen in New York. And before I have a background in structural civil engineering in Greece, I spent some time at the Architectural Association in London. And my main part of my architectural education was at the University of Pennsylvania. Next, so I'm originally from Athens. It's a very old ancient city, and it's all very layered. You can see like different pieces. And then for us, architecture means something very specific, and it has to do with light and classicism, and something that you grew up with. Next, and cannot quite avoid. This is my final thesis. I was working on computational models that they will calculate tensile structures. So you give it a flat image and will create a 3D shape. And these are some first studies that they create, that I create for my undergraduate portfolio before I even know what architecture is. Next. And I was also interested in photography and old buildings and how nature and architecture can come together and can be destroying one another or invade one each other. Next, and then I arrive at UPenn, which they tell me architecture is like this, or next one, or something like this, or next one, or the Architectural Association, something like this megastructure office hovering over Battersea. Just showing this to show the discrepancy between where I'm coming from, what I had the notion architecture to be, what school told me architecture is about. Next one. And then Diller, Scofidio, and Renfro, which it's a fun thing. I was just telling this story. I found this book from when I was 12 years old, and I have folded a page with Brasserie, which is one of the famous first places that DSR has designed in New York. And that was before I ever know I will go to engineering school, before I know I want to become an architect, before I ever know I will work in New York. But it felt like I was deciding for my future from back then. This is the High Line. Everyone knows it's a project that it's all about using existing infrastructure and using the space. So using a found object as a different way to see the city. It's a very interesting way that the studio is working. Next slide. So I would like here to showcase some of the projects that they're very special for DSR. DSR became very famous in the 90s and 2000s about more art projects, what do we call them, and performance art projects. So this is the exhibit we designed for Charles James show at the Met. It's the show that opens the Met Gala, which is the biggest fundraiser for the Costume Institute. So Charles James was a designer of gowns, and then all the gowns they have sculptural quality. So our idea, we can see in the previous slide for a second, was to design a gallery that its sculpture its dress is represented like a sculpture, and there's always a robotic device and a screen. And that was our approach to create next one, to build up this narrative, this augmented reality narrative, that it's not the museum goer that it plays with a screen, but it's actually a robotic device and an animation that we customly design, that they tell a story about its dress, about its construction. And on the other side, when you enter the gallery, the dresses just feel like a field of a forest of sculptural dresses. These are all mock-ups we did before. We programmed our own robots for this exhibit. You can see how the precision of in the previous one, you can see like the precision of the projector, like calling out a part of the pattern and explaining this infinite pattern, how it was actually created out of repeats. Next one. This is the digital model work we did. It's like these are all running through the Studio Max and Rhino, and we went 3D scan the dresses like they were actual buildings, how you will do when you want to 3D scan the existing space of a building before you implement your innovation. So all the tools were very architectural. I think that's an animation. I don't know if you can play or if it's okay. Maybe it got lost in translation because I should have it's fine. Next one. Different ways then with cameras to reveal details of each dress in the secondary gallery that with more contemporary gowns. Next one. Next one. So this is a special project that I really love. It was a collaboration between Liz and Miuccia Prada. So Miuccia Prada asked Liz in a letter to design 2 garments for her fashion show that they're inspired by her practice. And Liz felt the urge, instead of designing something that you will think is beautiful or functional, whatever, to design 2 things that they pose a question, which is like, can accessories and clothing be merged together? And here we see the first item, which is a garment bag, that we use the details that we found in this garment bag to be wear as a dress. Next one. So that was Liz's original sketch. So imagine the garment bag that you use to carry a suit or to carry your dress. But then when you arrive on your destination, you can wear the dress, but you can also wear this garment bag on top of it as an actual raincoat or as an overcoat. Next one. These are all the details in the prototype with created, and this is the prototype that Prada helped us create. Next one. And the second item was this idea of a working bag or life vest or a mechanic's bag or a purse, like this kind of device that it can be worn, but it's actually a purse. So we work on it ergonomically to work around the shoulders. The shoulders for us was a very important part of the design because as architects, we always want to think structurally, and the shoulders is where all the garments structure themselves. This is a prototype. Next one. This is the process we did in Milan, working with them to kind of like create the product. Next one. And this is some images from the show, from the final product in Milan in 2018. This is some projects I'm working on my own on the side. So the project got a lot of attention, and I was asked to help a friend design his set of 12 flagships in China. So this is the first one. So here the inspiration was the textures that one sees in Beijing, all the different walls, and how like different textures can create one building. So we use with local builders that they help us like carve different types of stones, and that's the facade of the building, and that you can see the different stones and the interior with the different minerals. Like we're trying to keep it very minimal. The idea was to create different spaces that they flow continuously, but they kind of create a uniform space. And it's another project for the same company that was further pop up in New York. The idea here was that you're called to shop in fashion like 6 months in advance. So that was for the spring collection, but it was supposed to go up in January. So the idea was that like the weather outside is extremely cold, but somehow you have to shop for summer clothes. So what we decided to do is to empty the full front room of the store and create an antechamber, or what we call a climate chamber. So we create this giant chandelier out of low iron yellow bulbs that create this warm heating effect, and we multiply it with mirrors to create this immersive environment. And that's kind of like what you would see on the store. When you go out, there's no clothes except from the two on the windows, but there's no clothes in this first space. This space is just for you to leave the city behind, come in, take a breather, relax, like change your mindset, and then immerse yourself into more warm environment. To add a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek note, we added this like hay bench so that you can even rest on it, as if like some very natural, very raw, very non-urban material. These details of the lamps. This is a video, but I don't think it will play. And I think I'm done, and you guys have 5 minutes extra.
Hi, everyone. I'm the League's program director, Anne Rieselbach. And before we start with the Q&A, I think everyone did a fantastic job, and thank you. And our aim each year is to show diverse approaches and many facets of what people can do with an architectural education. And I think these panelists more than illustrated that it's a panoramic view of different things. Todd, we did not get the short elevator pitch, at least, about DID. So before I start some general questions for all of you, can you tell everybody in the elevator pitch version what the DID initiative is that you're now heading?
Yeah, absolutely. So as in the multiple responses to an overdue and yet ongoing discussion of race and racism in America that grew out of the George Floyd and Black Lives Matter response, within Herman Miller, which is now Miller Knoll, Andy Owen, who's the CEO, was having the same conversations that small firms were having, that universities were having, the country was having. And from a design perspective, reached out to other organizations with the notion that to address the specific issues within the design industry, which if you look across architecture, graphics, industrial, interiors, collectively, Black designers represent less than 5% of the workforce, where they are around 13% in the broader workforce. So there's a huge disparity, and that tracks from university enrollment into jobs. So there's 20 founding members. They are design organizations at different scales. They're listed on the website, diversityindesign.com, but they range from, so I'll just mention a few, from 2x4, which is a practice in New York that has done branding for, say, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, to The Gap, which is, a big fashion brand, and everyone in between. The idea is that it's a platform that will grow and scale, but to address this disparity in 3 different fronts. And this is not an elevator pitch, now I realize, but like from early awareness at the high school level, addressing the disparities between HBCUs and other kinds of design education, and then addressing recruitment and retention through a collaborative model. I'm 2 months in, so we're still in the planning phases, but our first action will be in March in Detroit, which will be a teen design fair, which is cross-disciplinary and cross-sectoral in nature.
And what we will do for all of you is we'll follow up with an email with links to a number of the things that people have mentioned so that you have access to all of this. And I've asked all the panels to think of a question for each other, but I've got a couple more general questions I want to ask because a few of you mentioned mentors along the way. And so can you each talk about a mentor either in school or very early in your career that both, you know, made a difference to how you approach design and maybe tweak the direction that you followed? Delma, do you want to start?
Sure, yeah. I can touch on a couple of mentors. I think it takes a village, but the first ones that I would start with are my parents. I think that they had a significant influence just on the way that they taught me to value space and housing and structures and community, walkable places, you know, all the things that we kind of intrinsically are drawn to. I was always able to talk through those things with them, but also see the bigger picture. Okay, who's in charge here and who's building these places? And I think that's what gave me the interest in looking at the bigger picture overall and how these systems work. And then when I went to school, I mentioned that, you know, I was learning all about classical architecture, but we weren't really talking about the affordable housing crisis. So there was one professor, Douglas Duane, who's Andreas Duane's brother, who teaches at the University of Miami, or has taught, and, you know, big in the new urbanism, but mostly influenced me to look at urbanism and urban planning. I was really focused on architecture, and that really expanded my focus to look at cities and places from a larger scale. So I thought that was great, and how sociology, anthropology, all of these factors really influence place. And then some of the more recent mentors that I've had have been really phenomenal kind of actors in government. I really had a hard time kind of understanding how everything functioned, especially in New York City, right? It's a very complex system. So to have people who are lifelong public servants who have dedicated themselves to, you know, what can we do for the city in a job that's can be thankless or a little confusing or not very flashy. I've really learned a lot about how to do things and how to have impact on a greater scale, but move things along. You know, you don't want to wait 10 years for one project to get done. So how to be innovative within government too. Deborah Goddard, who was the EVP of Capital Projects, and Steve Lovesey, who now is the current EVP, have been really helpful.
Beau, how about you?
Sorry, I was muted. It's interesting. It's an interesting question. I do have some more immediate answers, but which I'll start off there. When it's also like it takes a village, and I'm thinking about some of the challenges that I came across throughout my professional career once I entered the job world, which a lot of it had to kind of what I was alluded to, like, you know, gender imbalances, and especially if you're not the traditional look of an architect, kind of be easily overseen. And I would say that a lot of my mentors came down to peers of a similar age group because we were all facing similar challenges. And a lot of my classmates from grad school, from undergrad, like every time we talk, it's the same problem. Why is it that more women have to exit their existing practices to be able to start their own, to have more agency? Because it seems like the ceiling is always there. And constantly having these discussions, and also seeing like having, and the general public, you know, Me Too was a huge monumental thing that really changed how we talk about ourselves in the context of professional development in offices, and even just finding ways of defending ourselves more, which was not the case when I was back at school. And so just seeing how history is actually acting as a mentor and learning from my peers and learning from the broader community of women, people of color, trying to fight for their voices, and kind of just understanding different strategies and also different ways of coping with potential trauma that you have experienced before, and kind of learning from everyone's experience. I did have a few key figures in early phases, in the early years at DSR, who did end up leaving the firm to start her own practice, who always told me to speak up and always be, and I've learned to pass that on to, peers throughout, because it's a numbers game at the end of the day, and that it becomes more and more clear as I kind of mature into the profession and you see all the various challenges that young people face. And I would also say that my parents are a huge, mentors. They have their own flaws, but seeing how they're able to persist in a lot of the struggles that I mentioned before, and being able to kind of keep their head up, I think is a good reminder that, there are a lot of things that can help you put things in perspective. What the daily challenges of being heard in architecture specifically are part of a broader range of issues that we all have to kind of continue fighting for as individuals and also as practitioners. So it's not a very good answer. It's just everyone is fighting the good fight. And I'm kind of happy that I'm part of a rapidly changing environment in which it's a lot easier to kind of speak up. So I'm very grateful for that.
This is great. And I'm going to have a follow-up question that about creating peer groups, but I want to go through all of you quickly first. Andres?
I have to say mentors for me, exactly, wasn't it ever like one person or two people? You just find them along your way and you take a little bit from all of them, and then you become a little, you take and you keep it with you. I mean, obviously Liz has been a very strong force of influence in my career and life and thinking about practice, but also like in her way, not only thinking about architecture and thinking about the work, but also in the way that she's very honest about pushing ideas that she thinks they're important and pushing forward her opinion, while she's always reaching out to inform herself better and get information from the environment and from the public and from people that she trusts her opinion. So that's not so much an architectural quality, for example, but it's like a trait as a person, this balance between always pushing for your own opinion and knowing that you have something inside you that you truly believe and you have to express, but also refining it by getting information from around. So it's like a small example of mentorship that you get exosmosis when you work next to specific people. I've worked a lot with Tom Main, who used to teach a lot at UPenn, and it's a totally different person than Liz, totally different person than me. Them two are very close friends. But again, exosmosis, you get something. So I would urge people, when I was younger, I was always worried that I don't have this one mentor, the classical mentor that you get in ancient Greece, or like in a book about the 1800s. Like it's different times. Nobody really sometimes has for a program like that. And some people you meet in your life, and you have to encourage the conversation with them and to open yourself to turn them into your mentors and like kind of like gain from whatever they're giving you through the process.
Todd?
I love this question. It's actually thematic to DID. One of the things we're looking at is how do we rethink mentorship and all the perspectives, including this one you just mentioned, Andreas, of so it's like something patriarchal a little bit about somehow how we approach mentorship. So in the same spirit, I think there's some influences early on from, Beatrice Colomina and Mark Wigley, who encouraged me to get that PhD that I never did, to Mabel Wilson, who in a more matriarchal sense is a mentor, she gave me permission to talk about race early on and continues to be an interlocutor, to my mother, that interior designer with a political mother, who I think, although her mother discouraged me, my mother has been really good about, from her difficulties in the workforce, understanding hidden agendas and navigating sort of stakeholder and office politics. To friends, I formed, a friendship with my first boss, who encouraged me to at some point leave Ralph Applebaum Associates, where I was an exhibit designer, and with other friends formed Program Collective, which I didn't mention, with Olga Subiros, Mona Kim. Olga's in Barcelona, Mona's in Paris, and Simon Taylor. And we had briefly a firm in the early I guess, mid 2000s. So yeah, it's an eclectic view of mentorship.
I have other questions, but some of the panelists have been sending me their questions for each other. And rather than me putting in my voice for the panelists who are speaking anyway, I'd rather have you do that. I can always throw in some of the other ones I have. And some of the students are asking questions too, and I'd like to have them an opportunity to voice their questions. So let me start with the panelists. And Andreas, you have questions for both Delma and Beau already. So why don't you go first and ask those?
Okay, so I actually have for Todd as well, but I would like to start with Delma. I love your presentation. I'm so happy to see that people like you are in these kind of positions and how passionate you are and your background. It just makes me smile. So I just want to know, like, we all live in this time of social media with like so much information, so much crossfire, families with families fight about politics, environment, everything. How do you use internet, social media, and to actually gather all this input from the public? And how do you guys, after that, try to filter it, and even harder, how to try to implement it into your projects?
That's a very interesting question that we're dealing with at this moment, because I don't think city agencies do it enough anyways. I definitely don't think NYCHA does it enough. But that's that's a result of the system, but also probably generationally. I think people my age may be a little bit more adept at understanding or using Instagram, Twitter data than folks maybe at 20 years our senior. And so I think we're starting to get into these positions where we're like, no, we can do a quick survey. We can really capture a lot of information that you always have to take with a grain of salt, right? Because of the digital divide and the fact that not everybody has access to internet, but that it can give you a lot of great information. So that's something that we are transitioning to do more so. We've started to actually do kind of surveys on Instagram where we have projects being implemented and we're asking residents what they want to see. We do digital surveying. We also capture a lot of the community work that's being done by other nonprofit organizations because we follow social media accounts. So we're able actually to engage stakeholders through events and partnerships that are already in place so that they're getting information from people and organizations that they trust, because we also have to acknowledge that there's a trust issue with lots of government agencies. So I think we're tackling it from lots of different angles, but we can and should be doing a lot more.
So maybe I can follow with my question for Todd. I mean, Todd, you have worked a lot on Exhibit and the Biennale, and I would like to tell us a little bit about your experience and the things you learned while curating different people's work or choosing like who is to be representing, or like the power, the responsibility that comes with that, like how do you navigate something like that? There's like so many different people from so many different areas that they're different than you, like when you work.
Thank you for that, because it's what I sort of jumped over. But I think this is for me where the leading and learning came together, where it was a learning process for me to be put into leadership positions, whether curatorial positions, or at the biennial, I was, an executive position, hiring the curators to make decisions, manifesting a platform of 100 partners that are also making decisions and trying to cohere them coherently somehow. And so I think I developed a way of manifesting my leadership as a learning organization, that we're learning from each other, that it's reciprocal, that I'm empowered, but I'm not a power per se, and that I'm here to facilitate and sort of support decisions. And I think the insight that I bring would be being an acute listener and seeing connections where maybe they were missed, and then pointing them out for others to take charge. So even when I was the curator at the Public Housing Museum, also skipped over this a little bit, my co-curators were women who were living in public housing, who who saved that building that is depicted, this ruin in which the exhibitions live, to say that we were here as a monument. So their idea wasn't a museum at first, it was a monument. And so my work was not to sort of be the authority on public housing, but rather to make space for them to share their authority through means that they didn't have access to, like exhibition making. So yeah, I'm a facilitator at heart.
Thank you. And then for Beau, I just want to tell me 2 examples for people to have measured, like what's the worst day in your architecture career and what's your best day in your architecture career like?
Oh my gosh. Worst day in architecture career. Honestly, I would say the qualities that make it worse are when I let negative comments bring me down. Because I've been at DSR, and DSR, as you know, Andreas, is a very competitive environment. But we've stayed there because there were a lot of pluses and a lot of things that you learn from an office like DSR that you may not necessarily learn at other environments. And earlier on, when I was still a little bit more kind of shy and less sure about my footing in the office, whenever someone had criticism over the work that I presented, I think I took it very seriously, and it often really was discouraging for myself, despite the fact that they might have actually intended on helping you. And I see that with a lot of young designers where that's part of the learning process, where if I'm providing criticism to someone that I'm mentoring now, I hope that they understand that it's not personal and that I'm actually doing it to help you be a better designer, be a stronger advocate of your work, and that other people will never actually have that strong of an impact over your trajectory as much as you do yourself. It sounds kind of like boilerplatey, but I think I've learned to kind of grow past that sort of internalization of criticism and kind of use everything that comes your way to your benefit. And oftentimes I found that moments where the best times are where we actually get into really heated debates on, especially on Zoom, everyone's like trying to talk over each other about design. And I walk away from these meetings feeling really empowered because we all actually really care about the work that we do, so much so that we're very, we're sweating over like a very tiny detail, but it's important because it does make a difference. You know, the devil is in the details oftentimes in construction build projects, but it's good to know that you're surrounded by people who are really passionate and really care, and to know that you're always learning from each other. So the best days are when we're in heated debates and we're all like trying to kind of find the best solution. And the worst days are when you're kind of more isolating yourself because someone said something that really hurt your feelings. Again, it sounds super cliche, but that's sort of my advice for myself and for everyone else, is to kind of take agency over the kind of criticism that comes your way, and always kind of mold it to your benefit. I don't know if that answered your question, Andreas.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm going to double back. Some of these questions, which can be grouped in general, talk about what you did in school and what you studied. So we'll start there, and then we'll finish with the school part and go on to things you do now. And so a few questions I had, and I'm going to add then a few questions that people had for specific speakers. In my case, I wondered, what do you wish you had studied that you didn't do in school? Then someone has asked, Delma, do you implement your classical studies today? And if so, how? And for Todd, someone asked what some of the theoretical work and readings that you had have resonated as you carry out your own ideas and designs, which I'm going to group into the when you're in school time. And then for Andres, was fashion and architecture design something you were always into, and which came first? And again, I guess that would resonate with the series of different educational experiences you had, but starting with engineering, which isn't necessarily the natural cognate with the work of Charles James, for instance. So who wants to go first? Actually, well, Delma, why don't you start, because there was a specific question about classical education and then other things.
Okay. So should I touch on both of those things that I wish I had? Okay, great. So I would say something that I wish that I had studied more, and this is particular to the path that I then went on, but is really understanding government structures and how things happen, right? From the very beginning, or at least from the school perspective of who creates these funding bills, how do billions of dollars get invested into our infrastructure and built environment, because that leads to a lot of jobs and a lot of jobs that we then go out and look for. So really understanding that system from school, I think would have been a little bit more helpful. But in school, I did study politics. I did study anthropology and sociology. So I think those were helpful frames that kind of led me in that direction eventually. And then to the question about, do I implement my classical training? I think I definitely do. I think there are principles of classicism, right? Not to get super into the weeds, but that are applicable across the board. Things like hierarchy, proportion, those types of principles, but also just the idea that places are places for people to engage in civic behavior. And I think that was an extremely important thing to me. I lived in Rome for a year, so just to understand that a place can actually activate you civically and empower you to be a part of your city and the decisions that are being made, or disempower you, right? I have a lot of experience in places that disempower you too. So to see those two things and study them pretty in depth, I think it's been a way that I have carried on with my classical studies, as well as the study of cities and how they have been done in the past and traditionally versus modern planning of cities, which are very different ways of looking at things. Some even, more violent than others. So all of those types of things, as well as what we designate as classical and like high classicism, right? There's a lot of importance in how we label things. And so coming from a place like Honduras, where there's a lot of informal development, there are a lot of places in Latin America that have great urbanism or urban planning, but maybe not by the book. And so starting to understand how these labels are created, and then because they're labeled, that's what you study in school, is helpful to me now, because I'm able to understand, oh, well, this is what classism is referring to in terms of the bigger picture, or the hierarchy of space, or the proportion, or how people are interacting in it. So I would say probably a very abstract interpretation if you went to ask my Notre Dame professors, but that definitely still very useful to me today.
Oh,
Sorry, was that for me?
yep. And I'm going to add one parallel track to that question. And that is because I know, for instance, Beau, when you were in school, you were also teaching and involved in some other things that represented passions in digital design and other stuff. So besides the what do you wish you had studied, another question I think that links with some of the other questions people have is, what were some of the things that you were doing on the side or with peer groups that either reinforced what you were doing or took you in that direction for the things that you weren't getting in school? If that's not loading too much onto one question. It might be. Okay, let's start with the what do you wish you studied?
I'll try. Oh man. Honestly, I wish I could study a lot of things. Architecture really just took up a lot of time. I had a lot of parallel, I would say, just more curiosities that I wish we all had, infinite time to study, like quantum physics, like something that I really, it's like totally not necessarily aligned with architecture, but it's still very fascinating to kind of just understand the greater architecture of the world. And also, I think to Delma's point, like just being more aware of the political structures and understanding how, how the world actually operates, which is not something that you really learn in school. You learn that through experience, and one may not still know that when you're much later in your life. And I would say one more specific topic that I think should be taught in school, and I hope is being taught now, is just environmental science, and how that's actually very important for architecture and always has been, but for, I would say, various reasons was never quite so quintessential to our curriculum. And it's challenging to find the time as practitioners to do that unless you're in a practice that focuses on environmentally based architect or architecture that deals with climate change. But yeah, so lots of different things, but I would say we're always learning. So still take classes on the side to pick up on things. And as far as independent projects that I do on the side personally, it's still kind of constantly actually taking drawing classes. I do it with my classmates and also with some of my colleagues. We find very kind of in the whole kind of drawing studios around New York City that are still open during COVID, and building a community of people who are more passionate, who are also just passionate about expressing like their raw, your raw kind of interpretation of what's in front of you. It's a very nice release, especially when you're always on the computer or you're always in being a diplomat with different user groups. It's very difficult to find the time to actually just do the basics that are kind of still form your fundamental self.
You're talking about hand drawing.
Yes, hand drawing. Yeah. I'll stop there. Everyone has lots of passions and projects, and I could go on, but yeah.
Well, we'll try to get it to that a little bit more, but Todd.
Thank you. I love that question, and it allows me to dig into something I also jumped over. So my theoretical interest in, I had been looking at media, the intersection of media and the practice through Beatrice Colomina and Mark Wigley's eyes. The idea that architectural practices are sort of constructed in the media was interesting, and specifically then with the sexuality as kind of intersection with that. Feminism was a big interest. And then, as I mentioned, race was not something that was in the school at that moment because someone like a Mabel Wilson was still in school. So all of that stuff I follow like now, even as it emerges as a real important thread of thinking. But when I was teaching that high school, I was taking a break, I thought, and to go back to get the PhD. And what happened was that I was 24 years old. And my students were seniors and juniors taking a design history class. So they were 17, 18. I mean, effectively now I would say we're the same age, but then I was the teacher, right? And so I'm like Luce Irigaray and Foucault, and they were like, what are you even talking about? Like, we want to like graffiti and, shoe design. And so I really had to rethink this like way that I had been presenting information. And that's actually what got me into exhibit design, was I really wanted to understand how to communicate. I mean, so every week at class, I just redid the curriculum to make it accessible to like the 6 years ago Todd that went to public school, right? That's somehow I got this other layer. So communication has been key for me. And I bring back the theory usually as a teacher. So I was teaching continuing ed at NYU for 10 years, an exhibition design course, where it was a way for me to critically frame the things I was doing with clients. But also it was continuing ed. So you could only get so theoretical when folks are like taking a weekend. They don't want to like have to go to all the footnotes. I recently this summer taught a RISD course, and a lot of the course, it was a studio course about curation for master's architecture students, but it was as much about communication and programming as it was about making like physical things. And I guess then I would say I wish we had learned more about communicating and even teaching, the way that teaching was manifest through this kind of model of like pressure and the competition kind of. I learned to communicate just by realizing like, yeah, I talk to my parents all the time. How would I explain this to my mom, right? So we should teach that.
Andres, and that can also fold into a question specifically to you, Andres. Was fashion and architecture design something you were always into, and which came first?
Okay, actually, I love this question because it's not the first time people are coming to me with that thought. It's something that it's obvious on my work. And I think there is a three-tier answer. Like the first part is like, yes, you caught it very well. Charles James and structural computational engineering, they're like much closer than you thought. And no, when I was doing my thesis in undergrad, I never thought, one, I will become an architect. Two, I will design a show that requires this knowledge. But the truth is that the same algorithm that I used to use to calculate the shape of the tensile Frey auto structure, it's the same algorithm we use to produce animations that they show how a flat pattern drapes with that exaggerated shape. And again, the constraints, the edge condition, what we call, it's exactly what gives it its shape. So it's one-to-one parallel. It's kind of shocking. So moving on from that, then fashion and architecture, they're very similar professions. They both have a very imaginative, creative part, like you have to create spaces that inspire people, that want them to act in a specific way, that make them feel warm or make them feel grand or make them want to do things. And on the other hand, they're very practical. You have to make clothes that are durable. You have to do them through the pipeline so it doesn't cost more than it needs to be. Same goes for building. So they're very parallel professions. Number three, which I think is the most important, is that both are a way of self-expression, not only from the person that is making it, but also from the person that is using it. And all the DSR work, and Liz is very interested in fashion, it's very interested in a lot of things, and it has to do with performance. Like fashion starts from the French court, when the lower people of the court tried to dress up to impress the higher people and then climb up the ladder. And then it's a tool that we all use to express a little bit of our inside, to become someone else, to become a little bit of the person that is we are in our head. And that paired up with my queerness as a person, it kind of like, yes, it is part of me. It's part of this constant struggle to express who I am. Coming to architecture, all the work we do at DSR, we don't have a shape. We don't have a way we design forms and shapes. It's all about the performance. What does the building do? What does the building encourage people to do? How do you use a building? I'm going to talk very quickly about the shed and the high line. The high line, our design is very minimal. The strategy is that you're in a continuous flow of people. You enjoy the city. You look around, the city becomes the player. You perform with the city. It's like a theater. So it's about creating a space that makes you become a person. You become the observer. You become the person that other people observe. You spy on the city. It's something that just makes you bring something of your inside out. The shed, the same. You're there and you're seeing your big part of this big art machine, or you're the artist. You're the conductor of this giant robot that you use to express your ideas, and you kind of trying to, it becomes your tools, like it becomes like a giant piece of clothing. So I personally, maybe I didn't explain it very well, but I personally find a lot of similarities on the work and the way that I have been taught to architecture with my experience and fashion. And as the last thing, I think that it's like, I'm still shocked about things that happened to me, like education-wise. Like I went to 5-year engineering school. I was learning all these things that I'm like, some days I will be like, oh my God, I hate it. This I will never use that. Why am I doing that? But then shockingly how life brings them back in different ways if you're excited to use them. So just try to be excited about whatever is around you and your resources, and using them to your best interest, and like pushing always your own agenda, but being like kind of greedy about taking everything that is around you and like using your education in your best benefit. Could everyone's education be a bit better one way or another? Yes, like I studied classics my whole life. There's a lot of mistakes in the classics. There's a lot of beautiful things to learn. The biggest arguments I have is like how all the mistakes that they actually do come from ancient Greece when it comes to equality and rights and things like that. But also there's a lot of beautiful things. So we are the filter, things are around us, and then kind of use them, we're filtering for ourselves, and we become the version that we want to be through what's around us. And that's what we can do. And always don't be passive, always act on the things that you want.
Rafi, can I break the rules and can we go like maybe 5 minutes longer? Yes. Okay. I'm going to group 2 questions, and these are going to be flash round answers. So the first one is just a flash round fun question from Delma to all the panelists. So 1 sentence or 2, saying if you could recommend 1 book, movie, or podcast that has changed how you practice, what would that be? 2 sentences each.
I'll
Todd?
start since
Okay.
I asked it, so I had a little bit more time to prep. But I would really recommend, kind of in line with all of my answers, is The Color of Law, which really helps frame a lot of the things we see in the built environment, and who made those decisions.
Beau?
Oh man. I will go a little bit back in time. Maybe I'll do The Art of War by Sun Tzu. It's very simple, and I think the translations are not super well done, but it's almost haiku style in like, if you're facing difficulty, how can you surpass it? And I think it applies to lots of different things. At the time, it was meant for strategic warfare, but yeah, I think it teaches a lot about how to be a good person.
Todd?
Oh my gosh. Come back to me.
Andreas?
Well, I want to say I don't really read architecture books. I'm sorry, I'm not big on the theory books. I love reading biographies, so I'm gonna just mention 2. One is like it's Amanda Foreman's book called The Duchess of Devonshire, and it's about Duchess Georgiana, who's like one of the first feminists and politician, and she's the leader of the British democracy. She's a scientist. She's Marie Antoinette's best friend. She's an adventurous woman. Her society didn't like her, and it's just very inspiring to see a person that like does the most with whatever it's giving to them. And believe it or not, being born as a woman, a smart woman in the royal court at that point wasn't necessarily a gift. And then the second one is something that I just read really recently that I loved, and it speaks a lot about the understanding of others and the times that we're going through. It was Edward Duvall's book, The Hair with the Amber Eyes. I love this book. It's so beautiful how through the objects you can see, first of all, architecturally, he does such a good job about describing all the different spaces the actual object has been and the history it carries and the memories. It's about Eastern Europeans, Jews, that they're based, wealthy Eastern Europeans, that are based in Austria, that they're pushed out during the war, and all the challenges and the internal fears and how the objects kind of become a vessel for these stories. It has a very beautiful serendipity and a very beautiful way of, very, very important way of telling the story of difference and understanding each other, and especially in days like that there's a lot of apprehension about each other, about difference.
It's super visual because he's a ceramic artist himself.
Exactly, it's so amazing. Like you wouldn't expect it, but everything's so three-dimensional.
Last question though, or Rafi will come after me through the screen.
Oh, I have a one line now. So I would say anything by or about Lino Bobardi. Done.
Right. Okay, sorry, oops, left. Last question, paraphrasing, because now all these students will be graduating with the next year or 2. So there was a question asking more generally, what would you like to see from your architects? What values did they want architects to have that will join the practice in the next year? So you're hiring all 4 of you. In 2 sentences, what would you be looking for from people?
I can start. I'd like to see excitement, willingness, and flexibility. I think these are the tools everyone needs, like passion, flexibility, and agility.
I'm really interested in this value of recognizing that our practice is highly contingent. and to bring to that an interest in facilitating power for others in the work that we do across design.
Yeah, I can add to that as well. We often interview a lot of people who have very strong portfolios, but may not necessarily be able to communicate within the team well. And so we're looking for people who are open-minded to changing their designs and changing their perspectives, and also being open-minded and willing to work with other people, as this is not a one-person profession by any means. And I think that's something that we all recognize today's day and age. And to be able to embrace the complexity and be able to deal with both the passion and the grit that is required, but also just knowing that regardless of what kind of is being thrown at you, to learn how to have fun with it. You know, it's not always going to be the best moment or the most glamorous thing that you get to work on, but everything is something that is an educatable moment. And just being, like what Andreas was saying, very open-minded, because you never know where you're going to learn something and actually be able to build something really great from.
Yeah, and I'll close out, just reinforcing that I think collaboration is key in today's world. Nobody can make a decision by themselves really anymore. So being able to collaborate well is highly important, but also having integrity. I think, once you know and understand where you stand, don't be afraid to defend that and to fight for what you think is right in your designs and your communication and your clients and the people that you work with. And good luck.
Perfect. I know it's totally cheesy, but if everybody could give a round of applause to these panelists who took a huge part of their Saturday morning. I know we didn't get to every question. I've been copying them and I'll send them to the panelists, so maybe we can have a few follow-up thoughts from them in writing.